So today we're going to be talking about the Zika virus. Right, so the Zika virus is classified under the genus of flavivirus. Right, so this is a flavivirus, which also means that it is a plus strand. Right, it is a plus strand RNA virus. Right, so we know that from its RNA genome, right? It's plus strand RNA genome that is found encapsulated inside something we call a capsid, right? So this is a capsid which is made up of capsid proteins, right? Which is being encoded inside the RNA genome, right? So the flavivirus, in this case the Zika virus, also has these surface proteins, right? These surface proteins. So this entire structure here, right, is known as a nucleocapsid, right? So the Zika virus is also known as an arbovirus, right? The arbovirus refers to any virus that requires a arthropod vector, right? Arthropod vector to be transmitted, right? So an example of such an arthropod vector, which is specific to the Zika virus, right, which I think we're very familiar with, is the mosquito, right? These mosquitoes, right? If the mosquito is infected with the Zika virus, right, or carries the Zika virus, and it uses this proboscis here to feed on the human system, right? It can introduce the Zika virus into the human system, and then it can have many symptoms. In fact, some of the common symptoms are the flu-like symptoms, right? As well as the skin rashes, which you can find at the infection site, as well as joint pain. So these symptoms are not very characteristic of anything. In fact, they look like a very simple flu infection, right? However, that's what makes the Zika virus infection very difficult to identify. However, it also has a very interesting symptom, right? That is usually found as a birth defect in children, but is also found in adults, and this is called the Guillain-Barré syndrome. So, what is this Guillain-Barré syndrome? So, the Guillain-Barré syndrome, right, is a it's an immune disorder where your immune system attacks the nervous system. Well, and this is actually not very common, right? But it is only present in 0.24 per 1,000 cases of Zika infections, right? And this could be a very important thing, a very bad disorder, and we're going to talk about it later. Right. So the Zika virus infection can also be asymptomatic. Right. The Zika virus infection could be asymptomatic, meaning that the infection itself does not present as any form of symptoms. So now we're going to talk about how the Zika virus infects the somatic human cell. So we're going to draw a somatic human cell here, right? This is the nucleus here and the shaded nucleus. So, right, we know that this is in the typical human cell. There is the cell membrane here, and it also here has this organelle here that looks very characteristic, and it is the endoplasmic reticulum, right? The endoplasmic reticulum, right? It's also known as the ER reticulum. Right. So the Zika virus, right, uses the endoplasmic reticulum as a site of viral replication. So first, your Zika virus, right, your Zika virus here is going to enter the cell using a process called endocytosis. So it's going to fuse with the cell membrane, right? It's going to form an indentation here, and then it's going to fuse with the cell membrane, and it's going to enter the human cell in this thing called an endosome. A endosome. So the endosome, well, in the endosome here, the Zika virus actually uncoats, right? The capsid protein, if we recall from earlier, that's coding the Zika virus now uncoats, and then the plus strand RNA virus, the RNA viral genome, is actually being released into the somatic cell, right? And it enters the endoplasmic reticulum where viral replication occurs. So your plus strand, right? Your plus strand RNA genome, your plus strand RNA genome, right, is the source of your proteins, right? So since it is plus strand, it can directly be translated, right? Okay, you don't need your mRNA because it's not DNA, and you don't have to translate. You don't have to transcribe your plus strand RNA because it is already plus strand. So you translate this into your viral proteins, right? Such as your peptidases, right, required for the modification of some of your proteins, your proteases, to digest certain proteins, right, and as well as your very important capsid proteins, right, required for the encapsulation of your Zika virus, right. So this is also replicated, right, to create more copies of your RNA genome, which is what's going on here, right? You're in the endoplasmic reticulum, right? You're creating all more of these RNA genome as well as all these proteins required, right? And they're being transported, right, over here. So you can see all these proteins, right, ready to package your cell. So it goes through another medium, right? This is the Golgi apparatus, this typical organelle that looks like a pair of pancakes, the Golgi apparatus. Right, so typically it's used in protein packaging, right, or post translational modification. But here, your Zika virus uses this process, right, and it takes advantage of the endoplasmic reticulum, and it's being transported into the Golgi apparatus, where it's allowed to be transported into the cellular membrane, right? And throughout this process, the Zika virus is being packaged, right, and it ends up as the full Zika virus, and now it's being released outside the system, and this is the life cycle of the Zika virus, right? So, of course, the all of this does not come with a price to the cell, and the cell undergoes through a lot of stress, a lot of cytoplasmic and mitochondrial stress, right, or otherwise known as oxidative stress. So now the cell, right, the somatic cell recognizes this using something called pattern recognition receptors. So these PRRs for short. So these pattern recognition receptors would recognize these symptoms, and the typical viral infection, right, it does these three things. So your cell first, right, it decreases the use of your nutrients, so it inhibits your viral replication. It also increases the expression of your type 1 interferon, right? So type 1 interferon, which we'll talk about later, right? And it also downregulates the expression of your MHC1 complexes, right? Which allows for your NK cells, your natural killer cells, to kill the cell initiating an immune response, right? And now back to this type 1 interferon, right? It allows the activation, right? The activation of your NK cells. So this is the typical immune response you see inside the inside a viral infection. So, but the Zika virus is unique, right? And it modifies the way the cell behaves, right? In the Zika virus infection. So now let's talk about that, right? The Zika virus actually, instead of downregulating your MHC1, it actually increases, right, the expression of your MHC1 complexes, right? So now your NK cells, right, which require the MHC1 to initiate the killing response, right? Your NK cells no longer see this downregulation of MHC1. So your NK cells are unable to identify that this cell is infected and is thus non-self, right? And this is very interesting because the Zika virus now goes undetected. Another thing your Zika virus does actually is that in the case of your type 1 interferon, right? So it inhibits the translation of your type 1 interferons, right? So it does this by inhibiting the activation of receptor-associated kinases, JAK1, as well as TYK2, which are used for the phosphorylation of latent transcription factors, right? And these latent transcription factors are STAT1 as well as STAT2. Right, and STAT1 and STAT2 are required, right, when they are translocated into the nucleus to associate with the IRF9, right, the IRF9 receptor to trigger antiviral transcription, right? So now it inhibits this transcription pathway, and I mean this is not all that it does. It mainly actually inhibits your translation, right? So when there is mRNA, right, mRNA of your type 1 interferon, right? Typically in eukaryotic cells, this is polyadenylated. Polyadenylated, meaning that at the end of your mRNA, it adds these poly A tails, right, of adenine, right? So this increases the half-life of mRNA. Well, the Zika virus actually inhibits this, right? It stops this polyadenylation. So now your poly A tails are gone, and now this is gone. Your mRNA actually the half-life actually now decreases, right? The half-life of your mRNA decreases, causing the degradation of your mRNA, which decreases the efficiency. It decreases the efficiency of translation. Right. So now your cell has a lack of type 1 interferon, and no longer do you see your activation, right, as well as your NK cells not being able to detect your Zika virus infected cell. So now your Zika virus goes completely undetected, or undetected at only detected at very low levels, right, creating a very weak immune response. Right. So studies have been done with the Zika virus in murine models, right? And they have discovered a very interesting phenomenon that occurs with the Zika virus inside the nervous system when associated with infection in the neurons, right? And how it relates to the glial cells you find in the in the nervous system, in the brain, the central nervous system, right? So there are glial cells, right, as like such as the astrocytes, as well as your microglia, right? They both help in the initiation of the immune response in the infection of a neuron, right? So between neurons there are synapses, right? There are synapses, and this is how you transmit your neurotransmitters, right? The neurotransmitters, right? Through action potentials, and that is what's needed to transmit the signals required to send to for muscle movement, for you to think, and etc., etc. So in the infection of a neuron, I'd say the Zika infected neuron, right? It causes, like, not exactly activation, but it causes morphological changes similar to activation in these cells. It causes cellular enlargement, right? As well as in the case of microglia cells, they phagocytosize your phagocytosize, or in other words, they engulf your neurons, right? So what happens when it engulfs a neuron, right? Let's say this neuron here is being engulfed, so this synaptic cleft is gone. So now you do not have this connection, right? There's nothing to transmit your neurotransmitters to, and nothing to receive. So your this synaptic cleft is now gone, right? It causes a loss of synapse, right? And this over time causes damage to your central nervous system, which eventually leads to decreased brain mass. And we'll get back to this later, right? So what happens to the astrocytes is that it helps in the breakdown, right? It helps in the breakdown of your blood-brain barrier, which also causes many complications, right, that are quite complex, such as the allowing of your inflammatory cells, right, your inflammatory cells, such as your macrophages and your neutrophils, to enter your brain, causing further damage to your CNS, right? And this causes one of the typical phenotypes you see in some of the Zika virus infected children. It's commonly associated as a birth defect, right? It's called microcephaly. So microcephaly it occurs and represents itself as a phenotype where typically the human brain is the size, of course, not drawn scale, just arbitrarily, right? So this is what the normal human brain looks like. Where in the case of microcephaly, you see that the brain is much smaller, right? And this represents itself with a smaller head size, especially in infants, right? So this decrease in brain mass is what causes, or at least it's one of the hypotheses of what causes microcephaly in the Zika virus infected human.